History 9, and we're trying to appreciate something which is very difficult to do, not just because it's slippery, but because it is habitually regressive. And what it regresses into is so natural to us that we do not notice that we have de facto regressed. Because it seems to us that we have just begun then to regain comfort, and it's the regaining of the comfort that is deceptive at this stage. This is very difficult to appreciate. This is why our learning has two modes that are complementary. One of them is integral, and the other is differential. And if you put them together, what you get is a clockwise motion of nature and a counterclockwise motion of consciousness. And when it's done that way together, they describe this kind of a situation, which is a symmetrically paired chirality. And if you do a mirror image of that, you get this kind of emotion. This is a magnetic motion, and the mirror of it is a synthetic motion. It is only the magnetic motion that gives you, in its symmetry, the ability to differentiate consciousness. If you use the mirror image of it, what you get is a synthetic idea in the mind. And this is a devastating flaw to do. The mythological equivalent of this, the myth of this, is Narcissus, who falls in love with his own image in the water. How beautiful I am. To be narcissistic, to fall in love with one's own image, is the very height of deception, which is self-deception. So our care in the double year is not to go into a deceptive synthetic mode, but to keep it chiral in a complementarity, because it's the complementarity rather than the synthesis that is the living fruitfulness of it. 200 years ago, one of the most poignant geniuses in the history of the planet came very close to finding the chiral development of complementarity, but failed to do so and developed instead a very powerful and potent philosophy of history based on synthesis. And his name was Hegel. And it was not that Hegel himself was deceived. He was an extraordinary figure, as we will come to see. And his two closest friends are two of the most remarkable figures in the whole development of European genius. And the three of them were roommates together, met together at a university, the University of Tübingen in Germany, which had been, by the time they were there, two of them arrived in 1789 and the third came the following year, 1790. So right around the time of the death of Benjamin Franklin, these three young geniuses came together in a university that had been in business by that time for over 300 years. And when it was first founded, it was like one of the first Renaissance schools in Germany, 1477. But when the Renaissance got really powered up in the northern European countries, not so much in Italy, although it then rebounded and came back into Italy, the northern European countries, instead of looking at the classic Greco-Roman civilization, looked at the Christian synthesis and summation of the Greco-Roman civilization, so that while in Italy you had a Renaissance, in Northern Europe you had what is called the Reformation. And the Reformation poignantly says we're not to look at the Greeks and Romans, but we're to look at especially Jesus and the early Christians, because it is the Christian synthesis of the two that is the powerful aspect. And so while you have this fierce competition for Greek texts in northern Italy, the Greek texts in northern Europe that they were looking at were not like Plato and Sophocles and Thucydides. They were looking at the New Testament. And because the relearning of Renaissance classical acumen to be able to read the original Greek language, which is extremely complicated because it has one of the most refined syntaxes and grammars in the world. It's like Sanskrit. You can really get refined in classical Greek. But New Testament Greek is like double refined. And the first person to be able to read New Testament Greek on a level with the ancients was a man named Erasmus. And Erasmus is different from the Greek genius of Ficino in the Renaissance, because Erasmus powers the Reformation by, for the first time since classical antiquity, making a fresh translation of the New Testament from the original Greek, which could only be partially read and superficially read during all of the Middle Ages, the whole medieval period. There was hardly anyone who could read openly the New Testament. When Erasmus finished his translation of the New Testament, it was a death knell for the credibility of the Western Roman Catholic Church, which they had to respond to in a big way, in a hurry, because Erasmus showed that the translations used in the Mass, in the liturgy, in the commentaries, were from badly corrupted, and in fact the centuries and centuries of interpretation had put on layers of what turned out to be complete errors. And one of the first people to read Erasmus's brand new, pristine translation of the New Testament was Martin Luther, who at the time was a standard Christian monk. And he not only threw off his monk's habit, but he got other people to do so. He got nuns to do so, and he married a nun. And he started powering up the Reformation so as to say, the Roman Church has deceived mankind for over 1,300 years, so we are going to rectify this in a very strong, powerful way. And the University of Tübingen was established in 1477 to be like one of those new centers where the whole deceptive Roman Church was the papacy was going to be fought by a very strong Orthodox Reformation, and one might say that their theme song was "Onward Christian Soldiers, marching as if to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before." When it was in the Reformation, Tübingen was like a revolutionary place, but after 300 years, it became still teaching the same stuff in the same way, but the world had changed, had gone on. History had developed, and so by the time young Hegel, he was 19 years old, got to Tübingen, he was admitted as the top student that year. He had the best preparation, the highest grades, and as soon as he got there, he met his first of two great friends, a young poet named Friedrich Hölderlin, who's one of the most important European poets, one of Germany's greatest poets, who's been somehow left out of the literary picture because while Hölderlin in his early life was a poetic genius, he had a nervous breakdown in 1806. In the last 40 years of his life, he, after this nervous breakdown, literally lived as a quiet guest in a craftsman's home as a semi-vegetable. But when Hegel and Hölderlin met in 1789, they right away compared notes and said, "This place stinks. This place is musty." And they're expecting us to go through a process where this is the final breaking down of our individuality, of our creativity. Because the whole purpose of a cemented Orthodox place is to clip your wings so that you fit in with the way things are and they go smoothly. And especially people graduating from Tübingen are going to be the ministers, the pastors of churches all over Germany and Northern Europe. And so the souls of other people are going to be entrusted to them, and so they have to be conditioned in such a way that they will take care of their souls in the way in which we want them taken care of, and not in some new way. And Hegel and Hölderlin, comparing notes, said, "This doesn't sound good to me. Doesn't sound good to us at all." And so Hegel and Hölderlin decided to become roommates, but there was room for a third person. And the third person that came in is a philosophic genius of the first rank named Schelling. And so he was 5 years younger, but he was precocious. He was let into the University of Tübingen because he was, and all his life, was one of the most flamboyantly brilliant people in Europe. Here is a translation of Schilling's Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature. On the history of modern philosophy, of Schelling, an introduction to his system of freedom. Translation of Schilling's System of Transcendental Idealism of 1800. He was all of 25 years of age. And so Hölderlin and Schelling supported Hegel, who was like clearly the monster genius, even among those three. And they called themselves the three friends, like the three caballeros. And they began to challenge the faculty and the student body of Tübingen that this was a revolutionary era, because look at the American Revolution that has happened just a decade or so before, and that they had just now, in 1788, elected their first president, who took office in 1789, and the French Revolution broke out, 1789, that this was a revolutionary war, and that they were going to be very special kinds of figures, that they were going to be heroes of universal freedom for mankind, and that they were no longer going to have their wings clipped, they were no longer going to fit in. In fact, they were going to tear out the false structures and bring in something completely new. And in doing so, they kept one foot in what had been the pride of the 1700s, the Enlightenment, of having a clear mind, perfectly balanced, of being able to look at things as they really are, and to begin to put together all of the different things in an encyclopedic context, so you knew what they were, where they were in their place, and that you had the clarity of mind to discover where you were in the place of the whole development. And in this enlightenment, they had one foot, but the other foot stepped out into a whole new era called the Romantic Revolution. And if Benjamin Franklin and Voltaire and a German writer named Lessing and the French writer Rousseau, if they stood for the Enlightenment figure, the new figure was a revolutionary hero who would no longer just be satisfied to be clear-minded for themselves, writing letters to other clear-minded men, that it wasn't just to be a thin oligarchy of intelligence, but that the population of men and women throughout the world needed to be wakened up to the fact that they are literally in chains. And the chains are not just economic chains. They're not just political chains, but they are mental and emotional chains that are inculcated before birth by an orthodox layering, so that onion-like people are born into a situation that they have no way to know that they are imprisoned. And not just in a prison, but imprisoned layer after layer after layer. And so the three friends, Hölderlin, Hegel, and Schelling, devoted the rest of their lives to adding their voices and their genius and their talent to people like Jefferson to open this up completely and do whatever they could to make sure that this imprisonment, that the vehicle for this imprisonment would be cracked forever, not just once, but that the entire structure of it would be given the treatment of like a lightning storm that fractured all of it so it could never hold again, could never be back again. Not just the American Revolution or the French Revolution, but the Romantic Revolution, that this required then superheroes who would be able to go into the jailer, which was a falsely educated mind that held all of those layers of deception together. And so someone like Hegel and Hölderlin and Schelling, almost to that level of genius, devoted the rest of their lives to finding a way to decimate and crack forever the false mind. And one of the greatest of all the books in the world was written by Hegel, called The Phenomenology of Spirit. And you find whole libraries of books on Hegel and whole rooms on the phenomenology of spirit. Here's the Phenomenology of Spirit Reader published by State University of New York Press, 1998. The phenomenology of mind. That using this romantic hero genius, he went into the structure, the phenomenological structure of how the mind is actually objective, and showing how the deception is anchored at certain specific points, certain specific relations and ways, and that because it is so complex, the only way to escape that tapestry of deception is to find a method by which one could patiently sweep through the structure of the mind and clear it out, clean it out, rearrange it so it became not only natural again, but at the same time it would become conscious on a self-conscious basis. But self-consciousness is a historical process. Consciousness is a visionary process, but self-consciousness is a historical process. And so they right away got into the whole problem. If it were just a visionary thing, because the New Testament deals with visionary, a restored new vision. But you do not find there the concern with the historical consciousness. Jesus is concerned in the New Testament with restoring the spiritual person back to the vision of the divine. And he says there is another who will come after me, and that one who will come after me is the Holy Spirit. He says, I have to go, but I will send the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit will make everything known permanently. Everything, for all time. So when they read this, the whole European, especially the Northern European, secret hope and desire was that in their generation this would come true. And so they prepared themselves not so much for a second coming of Jesus, but for the coming of the Holy Spirit. And that the Holy Spirit would, of course, come only by a purified vehicle. Whereas in the Enlightenment, the conviction was that it was a purified mind that would be able to receive the Holy Spirit. The Romantic Revolution was a transform of that it wasn't just the clear mind. The clear mind was just a base, a preparation. That what stood on that base was the artistic person whose spirit had flamed forth, and it wasn't just the pure mind, but it was the energized intensity of the fire of the spiritual person who then received the Holy Spirit. And so you had an age of revolution all of a sudden within a very short compass. And you can date it from 1775. Because in 1775, you find a confluence of incredible intellects in Philadelphia. And two of the most powerful, almost like flint and steel making a spark, is Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson meeting and making the Declaration of Independence. Which is extraordinary because it pulls a trigger historically stronger than anyone could have imagined at the time. Because it was not a political document. It was not just a colonial document against England. It was a universal document signaling the freedom from all of the constrictions of the mind and the person, allowing one to have mobility in history. And so the Declaration of Independence was like a pilot light that went on and made it possible for the first time since classical antiquity at its heyday around 90 AD to make it possible for a number of other lights to be lit from that pilot light. And one of the lights that was lit from that pilot light was the French Revolution when it first began. When Franklin left Paris in 1785, he was 79 years old, almost 80. And he had held on all that time because he realized that he was dealing with one of the most refined energies that there is. He was dealing with historical consciousness, which is a deep distillation of visionary consciousness, which is already a fermented transform from the clear mind of the balanced symbols, so that the energies of history are 3 orders beyond the power of the clear mind. And he couldn't leave. His favorite correspondent was one of his sisters, Jane Meacom, who was almost an intellectual peer of his, one of the most brilliant women of her age. And he wrote to her, he said, "I can now leave Paris in good hands because Mr. Jefferson is coming and he will take care of everything." When Jefferson left to become Secretary of State under Washington in 1789, he held a dinner at his embassy place on his last meal in France. And at that dinner table was Lafayette and all of the leaders of the French Revolution. And when Jefferson bid them adieu in the morning and got on the coach for Calais, the French Revolution broke out that afternoon in Paris by all of his dinner guests from the night before. Word of this scale of confluence, of genius, of flaming forth, took hold all over the world, but especially took hold in France and in Germany. And in Germany, it was like, well, we don't have the tradition that they have. Our tradition is just now getting started, but our start is very powerful because we have the greatest philosopher since antiquity who's living and writing in the German language, and his name is Kant, Immanuel Kant. And Kant had published in 1781, at the time when Lafayette was turning the tables on the British generals and beginning to plan to trap them at the Battle of Yorktown. About that time, Kant published the Critique of Pure Reason, which is the foundation of transcendentalism. And transcendentalism was that once the mind is able to have a critical understanding of how the mind is structured and works, the one who has the understanding becomes transcended beyond the mind. And that when you become transcended beyond the mind, you're not only able to look at the structure of the mind critically, and they called it after that the critical philosophy, because there was not just a criticism capable, a critique of pure reason, the structure of the mind, but there was a second critique, which was the critique of practical reason, of how that mind in operation affects existence, affects the world of things. And if you can have a critique of the symbolic mind and a critique of the ritual existential world, then it means that you can have a third critique. And the third critique will be a critique about who makes those critiques. And who makes them is not the individual in the mind, nor the character in the culture, not the figure in the rituals, but the artist in the spiritual person. And so the third critique of Kant was called the critique of judgment. It's all about aesthetics. It's all about art. And the critique of art is the raising of the ability to be self-conscious to a transcendent level. One of the first persons in the United States to understand the poignancy of transcendentalism was Emerson. And Emerson understood it because he could read German fairly well, and also because one of his correspondents in England was Thomas Carlyle, who was a great historian. He wrote the history of the French Revolution. But he also was encouraging Emerson that one of the key figures in this is Goethe. And that if you will just begin to read Goethe, you will see that the Enlightenment has a possibility of opening up into a whole new realm, the transcendental realm. And if you look at a bibliography of Emerson's library, there are more books on and about Goethe than any other 10 figures. He had almost 150 books by and about Goethe way back when, 150 years ago. And Emerson founds the transcendentalists in the United States, which included all of the brilliant people in New England of the day, not just Thoreau and Margaret Fuller and Theodore Parker and so forth, but later on, it formed the basis of a Concord School of Philosophy, and all of the greats, including William James and the Alcotts, Bronson Alcott and his genius daughter, Louisa May Alcott, they all spoke there at the Concord School of Philosophy, which was a transcendentalist school. But the kicker in the works was not Goethe nor Kant. The kicker in the works was Hegel. Because Hegel was impassioned by his two friends at age 20 to commit himself forever to destroying the false mental world so that it would never be able to be resurrected again. Not just to defeat it in argument, but to fracture it so that it could never be put back together again. And when he did so in such a way that he was unable to detect that a mirror image of it that turns it inside out could be made and could be used for a mirror image inside out of it that would result in an even more subtle form of enslavement and imprisonment. And the person who made the mirror image of it was Karl Marx. And Marx's mirror image of Hegel's philosophy lent itself to the violent revolutionary tact of Vladimir Lenin and Stalin. Stalin means steel man. And so the Russian version of Marxist Leninism, which was a mirror reversal of Hegel, led to the development of the Soviet Empire. All of this was laid at the feet of Hegel, and for decades and decades in the 20th century, he was castigated as having laid the groundwork for Marxist-Leninist violent empire. Whereas you do not find that there. It's not a violence in Hegel. It is a spiritual intensity of the romantic hero to go out into the universe of the mind and to find out its complete structure, not just on the level of Kant's critique of pure reason, and not just on the level of the way in which it works. Kant's critique of practical reason is a great work, but in no way does it come up to the level of the phenomenology of the spirit by Hegel, because he shows you have to look through the mind, not at the actions that you do in the practical world and the things of this world, but you have to be continuously self-conscious of who it is who is looking through that mind at these things and judging it in terms of a transcendental ratioing that is not just a proportionate thing like in geometry, but is a constantly shifting proportion, because every time that you make a proportion, by having made that proportion, you change slightly the elements that go into that proportion, and the very next moment you have to make a new calculation on the basis of what you had just now seen, and that is a continuous process. We call that today an algorithmic change. And so Hegel is of this age where for the first time there was an intelligence that was able to understand we have to be able to keep track of infinitesimal changes as they are going on and not get lost in them or get impatient to tack it down and say, well, this is a close enough approximation. And a contemporary of Hegel in France, a man named Fourier, is the first one to develop a whole mathematical series of transforms, the Fourier transforms, that allow one to do this, and they're still used today because they're valid for all time. Fourier was such a genius that when Napoleon took his expedition to Egypt, his armies, his savants and everything, and he wanted this enormous series of elephant folio volumes on the Egyptian wisdom published, he put Fourier in charge, and Fourier did about 20 volumes called, in French, The Description of Egypt. And it had, I'll bring next week an original engraving. They're 3 feet by 2 feet. And for the first time, you see not only that ancient wisdom is starting to be understood and brought into play, but that the very sites, the archaeological, the anthropological, the philosophical aspects of that thought are brought back into play in such a way that they will self-refine each other over time. And since that time, since the early 1800s, in the last 200 years, we have had more change in our species than in all the time before that. And we're on the verge, early in the 21st century, to become extraterrestrial. Not just in orbit, but the whole star system, just for openers. People are alive today who will live way out on the star system. We're becoming a transcendent species from our home planet in actual fact. But 200 years ago, it was the beginnings of that pilot light and the finding that you do not have to have a worry that that pilot light is going to go out. It won't stay lit. The worry is not that. The worry is that it cannot be communicated to a large enough population of people who will then use this to improve their lives. There will always be special men and women who will understand this. But on that level, it keeps it secret de facto, keeps it esoteric by happenstance, and makes it seem as if it's some kind of occult thing rather than being a new quality of ordinary life for everyone. Now, let's take a little break. Let's come back to the pilot light. The pilot light was a historical triggering that remained as a fulcrum. But instead of just a fulcrum as the traditional sacred flame, it now had a magnetic quality to it, that if someone approached it, they would get magnetized to the complete harmonic that was there in that pilot light, and not just light a torch from it so that they could carry that torch on and that others could light their torches from that torch, but that this was like a magnetic field that would touch the entire world and touch the population of human beings, touch mankind in such a way that everything be magnetically energized so that every single aspect of the world and of the mind would be open for transform by the spirit of the person. The difficulty 200 years ago for these people is that they were struggling with a historical circumstance that they did not fully appreciate and understand. There was no way for them at the time to understand. Just as in the Renaissance had brought in a revival of antiquity, which they considered a great advance over the stagnant medieval centuries. But when they brought antiquity back in a revival, they revived all of the negative aspects of antiquity as well. And because they revived closer and closer to the center and the transforming fulcrum of Greco-Roman antiquity, its two parenthetical halves made a very deep difficulty by the time that America was being discovered in the 1490s and the 1790s are a sophisticated inherited replay of the difficulties of the 1490s. For instance, in Renaissance Florence, as soon as Lorenzo the Magnificent, Il Magnifico, died, the Medicis were driven out of Florence for a number of years, and a fundamentalist monk named Savonarola took over the city of Florence with fiery hellfire sermonizing and warnings until finally he was seized and burnt at the stake in Renaissance Florence himself. All kinds of difficulties came up, and one of the most poignant of all of the art works of that era was by Ulrich Dürer, who was the beginning of the Northern Europeans getting the Renaissance, and he did an engraving around 1500 of an angel sitting with his chin on his hand, looking forlorn. And the angel is surrounded by all the new Renaissance things like the armillary spheres and the new pyramids and all the magic squares and all of the ancient things of antiquity that had been revived and now were being improved. And yet it's called melancholia, because the angel is stymied, because that angel only existed in a mythological horizon that the new history energy of the Renaissance was dispelling. The angel was a mythological character who could only live on the mythological level and could not live in a spirit-energized history, would be seen as a mythological figure and not at all something eternal, but as a part of an evolution of a historical process at that time. In the 1790s that we're looking at now, history became the number one problem. As we are trying to have a new world, as soon as we do, it tends to curl back upon itself and produce even worse conditions. When the French Revolution was first brought into play, it was like a grand, let's open up the doors and windows and let's go out into a new nature. But very shortly after that, it was like, let's take to the streets. And very shortly after that, let's kill all the old ones that terrorized us. And so you had something in the French Revolution called the Terror. And it was much like the Red Guard movement that Mao put into play in China in the mid-1960s, which devastated China. So too, the devastation that happened along with the Renaissance carried over, because not only was it the Renaissance then that brought all of this back into play, but as soon as the Reformation singled in and said, well, the most powerful of all the persons that came out of classical antiquity was Jesus, and that means then that we have to bring Jesus back in the original, the pristine, that pristine quality. And out of this came a whole movement in the Renaissance to try to find, well, what were the original Christians like then? They wouldn't have been like the church said, because the church came into play, into being decades after. What were the original people around Jesus like? And so there was a movement increasingly in the Reformation, in the Renaissance, encompassing the Reformation, to try to get back to the original primitive Christianity. And out of this came a movement of people trying to find, how can we purify our lives and our minds so that we can do this? And out of this came the Puritan strain of European history. But in Northern Europe, where the Puritan strain was not so much limited to small groups of people who were trying to work on themselves. In Northern Europe, you found a development of the Puritan strain called Pietism. And the German Pietists especially were out after having the organization of whole communities that would allow for the mass production of this return back to primordial Christianity. And so while the Puritans were largely individual or family-oriented, the Pietists were largely on the basis of utopian communities, which then would proselytize. And out of the Pietist tradition in Germany came more and more the conviction that what kept getting in the way was that the world kept encroaching upon these communities and keeping them small. And where the individual had been entrapped before, now the communities are entrapped. We're always having to go into retreat to maintain our pietistic community purity. And they were always searching for places in the New World that were newer so that they could have their retreats pure. And so you found that the original utopian communities on the Atlantic coast finally, within a couple of generations, were being located on the Ohio River near the Wabash. One of the largest communities there was called New Harmony, Indiana, near Evansville, Indiana. And that because one couldn't maintain one's purity even there long enough because civilization was encroaching, actually what they would have meant is that the tidal wave of the regressive culture kept catching up with them, and so it drove them further and further west. We have to get away from this. We have to go and found some kind of pure place like Salt Lake City, or some really pure place like California, or at the end of the trail in Oregon. And finally, it was so much that the continent was engulfed, and so one had to go and find the paradise in the South Seas, in the islands. We have to get away from all of this. And increasingly, this became apparent already in the late 1700s. And the response of Hegel and Schelling, Hölderlin, and a number of people of that era, Jefferson, was not only to open up further frontiers, to keep the civilization progressive so that the regressive acculturation didn't catch up and smother it, but that there needed to be then developed a new kind of person who would not be susceptible ever, who would be immune to the regressive acculturation that tried to re-glom people. And so how do you make? You can't except by education. You have to find new ways to educate human beings so that they will be immune from these pressures. It isn't just that one has a new frontier out there, but one has a new immunity in here. And that this became then an interesting thing. How do you balance these two? Because they're quite distinct. And as long as you're looking at goals or purposes, you keep getting caught in a dichotomy. Now, it was Hegel who came very, very close to finding the resolution of complementarity. But he had no experience with China or India or Asia at all. Didn't understand Africa. Didn't understand the New World. Understood in the best way, but in a pan-European way, which itself was in a categorical set limitation, even though it wasn't apparent at the time to many of those people. And what he came up with, instead of understanding the deep profundity that historical consciousness is a chirality going in the paired direction of nature, he saw that somehow consciousness makes a new thesis about reality and engenders then this polarity, the antithesis to it, and one can deal only with it effectively by a new synthesis, which then becomes a new thesis that has its own polarity. The polarity is engendered in the mind phenomenologically. It's a fact. The mind will always engender a polarity because it is a structure that is built and based upon completion. And every time you have a pro, you're going to have a con. Every time you have a positive, you're going to have a negative. And one of the qualities is that when they're brought together, if you bring shadow and light together, you get the contrast that makes a deeper realism. And one of Lessing's most profound things was that true art on a grand cosmic scale always has a little bit of the terrible in it. It isn't just beauty, but it's the opposite of beauty. It's the terrible, so that one gets this new vision of a terrible beauty, which in its mirror opposite is a beautiful terror. But Lessing also put in, he said, this is something where the disgusting, which is a deeper human revulsion from just the ugly, that the ugly will contribute something to the balance where you will notice beauty more, but the disgusting that is added to it doesn't add to beauty at all, but when it comes into play with the terrible, it changes the terrible to the horrible. Now one has a very skittish kind of a mentality, that you become fearful of progress because it is inevitably going to sour into a nightmare. And the all-time great presentation of it in the Romantic era is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. If you try to make a Superman, you're going to end up with a Frankenstein. If you try to mutate foods, you're going to end up with Frankenfoods. Why is that so inevitable? Because the cycling of nature brings itself around in such a way that the complement to it, the ecology of consciousness, will in a symmetrical way bring itself around. The evolution of nature has a symmetrical evolution of consciousness. But whereas nature's evolution is not circular but cyclic, and because it's cyclic is always slightly changing through variation, its variation is not to make a cycle of a circle, but a cycle that is very small, and yet it is spiral. But because the spiral keeps spiraling, each time you spiral, the spiral opens up more and more, so that the image, archetypal image of nature's cycle is like the chambered nautilus shell, constantly opening more and more and more and more. It's a constantly opening spiral. So that its complement in symmetricalness is that consciousness also spirals and keeps opening and opening more and more. But whereas nature's spiral has a proportion based on 0 and 1, the one emerging whole out of 0, consciousness's binary is 0 and infinity. That infinity keeps opening out of the zeroness. And that if you just try to do a synthesis of it on the level of the symbolic mind, you will end up with a fractal patterning, which always, yes, does open up, but it opens up in an infinity of repeats. The larger structure will always be a repeat on scale of the smaller structure, which itself has a smaller structure into the infinite, both big and small, but they are always a repeat. And so what you get de facto is a dead end in a fractal seeming surprise. But the deepest quality that is there is that if you run an algorithmic fractal, it will emerge out of its own chaos a pattern which is cosmic constantly. It's the butterfly effect. It's the double attractor. It's the infinity sign. that in the graphing of any random process, any chaotic fractal process, if you run it fast enough, long enough, that infinity quality, that double butterfly, will occur. It will occur not automatically, but because this is the reality. And in fact, there is no such thing as chaos. Chaos is simply a confused state of harmony. It's like in music composition, early in the 20th century, when the genius of Arnold Schoenberg was discovering that you can compose a music out of a 12-tone scale. You don't need to have an 8-tone scale to make music, but when you use a 12-tone scale, the music has a continuity, called it serial music. It has a continuity that allows for the harmonic to include everything, including dissonance. And so in his theory of harmony, 1911, Schoenberg said, dissonance is just a larger distance between the harmonics. And that one can educate oneself, one can train one's ear, one can transform one's aesthetic so that you can hear the hidden harmony in the dissonance. One of the great 20th century composers who developed that almost to a T was Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. And in order to show, Stockhausen said, well, we need to transform all of the music art forms, and so he wanted to transform opera, and so he wrote a series of 7 operas that the set would be called Light, and you would have an opera for each day of the week, but they were arranged in such a way that the cycle of that week did not make a dull repeat, but every time you went through that cycle, you were acclimated enough that you would hear the next cycle in an even deeper way. And so you have something like our learning here. It isn't just that one has already done the phase of nature. Each time one would go into the phase of nature, you would be matured to such an extent that more and more of its infinity would be released. And so consciousness has this kind of a quality where it is not integral but is differential. But the highest dynamic of vision is history. And so history is not at all a dead record of things that have happened and are over and that the symbolic mind now categorizes. That is a mentality which is flawed severely. And it comes out most deeply about 200 years ago, and then resurfaces in the 20th century, most poignantly in the 1930s. And the figure in which it resurfaces catastrophically is in Hannah Arendt. She, by circumstance, by genius, by incredible fortuitous positioning, found herself magnetized by 2 of the greatest philosophers of that time, Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers. And she began having this in 1924 when she was just 18 years old. She was extraordinarily beautiful. She looked like this in 1930 when she was 24. When she was younger, her quality was so pristinely, not only the beautiful woman, but the incredibly intelligent, beautiful woman who was at the same time the inheritor of 200 years of this romantic hero But the romantic hero back then was largely masculine. She was a feminine Athena with Aphrodite qualities in the midst of an almost purely masculine revival of 200 years before. And Heidegger, very, very similar to Hegel, such that there are whole comparative studies, and this one is called Hegel, Heidegger, and the Ground of History. But just as Hegel's philosophy was misseen in a mirror image and became Marxism that lent itself to Leninism, the mirror of Heidegger's philosophy became one of the mainstays of the National Socialist Party in Germany, the Nazis. When one goes back to look, where does this terrible beauty, dead end, come from? One goes back and finds here one of Friedrich Hölderlin's most powerful poems called Patmos. Hölderlin, the roommate of Hegel and of Schelling, one of the greatest poets of all time. Here's a translation. Patmos is the island in the Aegean that St. John was exiled to by the Emperor Domitian, who feared to kill him, and so thought he would just shut him up permanently by exiling him to this island that just was rock, shaped like a stone ship that would never go anywhere. And it's on Patmos that he wrote the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. Here's the romantic hero as poet, Hegel's roommate, writing Patmos. Just a few lines. Near and hard to grasp the God, yet where danger lies, grows that which saves. Eagles dwell in darkness and without fear. The sons of the Alps span the abyss on lightly built bridges, since the peaks of time lie heaped round us, and those we love live near, languishing on separate mountains. Give us innocent waters. Oh, give us wings, so that, faithful-minded, we might cross over and back. In other words, from the alienated isolation on these peaks of deceptive mind time, we need to recover our ability to go in between the barriers that keep us apart, that keep us isolated and alienated, especially from each other. We have to find new wings by which we can communicate with each other. And so one of the first seminars that Hannah Arendt took after her torrential affair with Heidegger in 1924 and 25 in the summer of 1926 at the University of Heidelberg, instead of taking another just Heidegger course, she took a course from Karl Jaspers on history. And in the summer of 1926, she was just 20 years old, Jaspers invited his seminar people that if you would like to ask questions, I don't take questions in the seminar because I'm teaching you something very difficult to understand, but I will take written questions. So her first letter to him, July 15th, 1926. Dear Professor Jaspers, I hope you will permit me to make use of your offer to accept written questions. Some of the final points you made in our last seminar meeting concerning the possible philosophic interpretation of history continues to puzzle me. It's really smart. I can understand history only from the perspective which I myself occupy. My absolute consciousness, she's 20, attempts to enter into communication with the absolute consciousness that lies behind, as it were, the works that have been passed down to us. What is that absolute consciousness, that spirit behind? It's Hegel's spirit moving behind the historical process. That would mean that I try to interpret history, try to understand what is expressed in it from the perspective I have gained through my own experience. What I am able to understand in this way, I make my own. What I cannot understand, I reject. If I have understood your view correctly, then I have to ask, how is it possible, on the basis of this view of the interpretation of history, to learn something new from history? Doesn't it make history simply a sequence of illustrations for what I want to say and for what I already know, without benefit of history? To submerge oneself in history would thus mean no more than finding an abundant source of appropriate examples. And Jaspers, wisely, because he's a very great man, inviting her, not cautioning her, but inviting her, there's something more that is going on here than you know, as long as you keep yourself tethered in this knower. Because as long as you try to figure it out in your mind, the mind will figure it out mentally. Whereas the problem is not in the mind. The problem is that the expansion of the mind into vision is not being given its free play in the spiritual person as an art of being, so that the historical energy is happening. What is happening instead is that the mind, because it is coming out of experience, goes back into experience again and again, trying to figure it out, figure itself out on the basis of experience. And because of the integral nature of this whole ecology, it keeps zeroing in and zeroing in, and as it does so, it gains the conviction through the effort that it's getting closer to the truth, when actually it's just circling into the point where it will be stuck on its own pin against the board of the mind. It's very difficult to understand. Jaspers is one of the world's greatest philosophers. And his philosophy was called existentialism. That one can go back to an existential being in the world, existence in German with a Z. That existence is fundamental as long as it emerges completely what it is and only what it is out of nature. Because there is no way for nature to manufacture a deception. As long as existence comes instantly and purely out of it, it will be natural and objective. And so one can trust that the experience that is generated out of that pristine experience will have an ability to be indexed as a truth. Now you notice in this the pattern that we talked about before, German pietism from Puritanism. That if one is able to retreat from the deceptive world to the real world, one can then have an experience of pristine reality that reoccurs in you, and that your mind, basing itself on that kind of experience, will spontaneously deliver truth. It won't lie to you. You will not be lied to, because there is no basis in that whole ecology for deception to occur. But in order to check that, the existential quality of doing in the world with things has to be paired with a clarity of mind. But the mind is not a clarity that is existential, it is a clarity that is phenomenological. And so Jaspers is the author of one of the first textbooks in psychiatry. Monumental, still in print. After 80, 90 years, still in print. The phenomenological existential therapy, psychotherapy, has a poignancy that only when you have the entire ecology tuned will it work. And the only way to check that it is in tune is that you have to be able to have a transcendental quality of person who can hum that tune and make sure that it comes out as the song and not as something garbled. The proof of it is not the eating of the pudding, but being able to see the art of it. And so there is a complementarity involved between the artist and the symbolic veracity of the mind aligned with the body. But just as the mind and the body align, the art of the person, or the works of art, harmonize themselves. They don't align, but they harmonize themselves with the cosmos. And so the way that art checks itself is to see whether scientific objectivity is harmonic with it. And so you align the mind with the body in this world, but you resonate your person with the cosmos in a differential mode. And when they are balanced together, those two chiralities are balanced together, you get this ability of the double attractor, the infinity sign, that occurs spontaneously. And one has this, it's in ancient times it's called a triple veracity, thrice greatest Hermes. The triple veracity is that the symmetricalness of it lends to the complementarity not a unified quality of completeness, but a pristine quality of perfection. Now, that when consciousness in its full ecology is in complementarity with the full ecology of purified nature, what you get is not just completeness, but you get perfection. Yeah. It is a perfection not of oneness, but of everything. Everythingness. One of the most profound and beautiful poems of the 20th century, long poem, 160 pages, by Yevtushenko, called Bratsk Station. Bratskaya means brotherly in Russian. And in his hometown of Irkutsk, in Siberia, where his ancestors were exiled, and they built a very nice city on the Angara River, one of the big torrential rivers of Siberia. And there, outside of Irkutsk, they built a hydroelectric station, a dam, Bratskaya Station. And when it was finished, Yevtushenko, who had been parading his poetic in Moscow, was banished for the umpteenth time. You got to go back to Siberia. He went back joyously because he got to see the new hydroelectric station, Bratsk Station. And he went down and he realized that this station wasn't just a dam. It wasn't just an industrial monster giant, because when he got down into the turbine bowels of Bratsk Station, he heard the resonant hum of these huge turbines everywhere in this enormous underground cavern. And what he heard was their harmonic. And in the poem, he writes in Russian, it translates into English over and over again. I heard the voice of Bratsk Station. Everything, 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 everything. And he said, the pyramids were monuments to the dead. This is a monument to the living because it gives them light and energy to improve their lives. Who's exiled? More next week.